This is a radio broadcast addressed from the League of Nations on the global war effort against the Morgana threat, where we report the recent happenings amongst the major nations contributing to the defense of our united front. I'm your speaker, Ammaraglio Maus, but you may refer to me as Commissar, or simply the Speaker, whichever you or your government prefers. Now, from what I've heard, some listeners out there didn't receive last week's broadcast, and I apologize for that. The Morgana had been interfering yet again, and it seems last week's broadcast was lost at sea, so to speak. However, our technicians here at the station, with some assistance from PC Bruno, believe they've solved the issue. Now, hopefully, back to the news, free of Morgana meddling. We find ourselves in the third week of December, and the strange weather phenomena occurring in certain parts of the globe continue to worsen. And alongside that comes troubling reports of a new Morgana battleship of unknown power. Despite this, each nation continues to do their part to curb the Morgana threat. First up, news from the League itself. Following the League's investigation of Morgana collusion in the Baltic, the League Tribunal released a statement this week, this time regarding their investigation and hearings of acting Kriegsmarine Captain Eric Fennick. For those not in the know, Herr Fennick, as acting captain of the KMS Admiral Scheer, had found himself transported across the Atlantic in the early days of the war, and had come upon a Morgana group attacking an American vessel, the SS Pancraft. Fennick and his crew had managed to rescue the civilians, many of whom stayed on as volunteers aboard the Scheer, and then sank the Pancraft to keep the Morgana from claiming its cargo. The League Tribunal concluded that Herr Fennick was cleared of all wrongdoing arising from the event, and moreover, the tribunal recommended that Germany not be held liable for actions of acting Captain Fennick. Insurance companies around the world protested strenuously, sources say, but anything else might have ended German participation in the INPF. With that comes news from the Comintern. After finding middling success in PC Bruno, the Comintern sent its agents out to infiltrate and recruit from Finnish emigre communities from around the world, which effectively meant Sweden and the United States of America. Sources stated that there were some promising leads, and they were content with their early efforts. It seemed likely that there would be at least a few less voices in favor of aid to Finland, and a few more actively resisting it. Alongside that, the narrative of Finnish collusion with the Morgana was already bearing fruit, in particular inside the United States, which had just suffered from the perfidy of sedition. But there was one caveat. They had been relatively aggressive in their efforts in the U.S. since the start of the war, and there were hints that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was taking notice. In future, there could be no carelessness. Following that comes news from Italy, who continues to be the leading nation in combating the Morgana threat, hunting them down whenever and wherever they may be. With Vanity's fleet pummeled to dust in the Aegean Sea, and both Athens and La Maddalena avenged, the Regia Marina looks towards home as Morgana activity has been rising in the Ligurian Sea. With 90% of captains in support, the Regia Marina enacted the war plan Ligurian Sea Patrols, strengthening western patrols of Italy, while regretfully tolerating Despair's meanderings in the western Mediterranean. For now. They were welcome sight to the Italians of the mainland, of course, and even to the French from the land border to Caen. The other service that Italy did for France this week was a more somber one. Early in the morning on December 17th, the Regia Marina returned the Bougainville to French authorities in a short ceremony held in Mogadishu. It was also reported that the ship's cat had been pampered wonderfully. The jester was received well in Geneva, where concern had been growing of a diplomatic crisis of another type. For weeks now, there had been sightings of a terrible Morgana fleet moving into view off the East African coast and the Seychelles, but its actual impact had been minimal. Indeed, it had been nearly impossible to find. Its presence alone, however, was enough to instill fear in those in the surrounding area, and it was the talk in the coffeehouses of Mogadishu as well as Rome. And of final note, it was rumored credibly that Hitler was furious at Italy's decision to expand the Anglo-Italian agreement, and it's certain that Germany means to drive a wedge in between Chamberlain's government and Mussolini's at the earliest opportunity. Perhaps those in Italy should focus more on domestic affairs and shipping, as that's where Germany is most likely to strike. Following that, we turn our attention to the Pacific with the Empire of Japan, who is the second leading nation contributing to our united front. The big news for this week involves the famous first captain of the INPF, who arrived in the waters of northern Japan upon Japanese invitation to investigate the strange occurrences in the seas off Sakhalin. As a secondary matter, the captain was called upon to investigate the ongoing Morgana crisis on land at North Sakhalin as well. While the Japanese had more than enough naval assets to drive the Morgana away permanently, the captain afforded a prestigious and internationalist option to resolve the issue without the possibility of escalation with the Soviets. Some pundits suggested that it was much cheaper than sending a fleet too, and as a result the First Fleet directed its attention to the Sea of Japan and to Tokyo Bay, securing the approaches. Further afield, things were a bit more complicated. Fire and her followers regrouped after the previous week's engagement and staged a raid on the Ryukyu Islands. She did not attack any settlements, which were far too defended by well-prepared and sighted guns, but did spend a significant amount of time near Showa Iwajima, and she apparently returned back to the Bonin Islands on the 18th. Meanwhile, the Second Fleet was engaged further south, near the coastal border between Hainan and Indochina. Chinese rebels were known to be active on the French side of the line, and rumors of contact between them and the Fuyuri, made all the more convenient by the pervasive mists, had to be investigated. Though no direct evidence was immediately forthcoming, valuable contacts were made in Indochina, without undue objection from the French and the British, who were more than happy enough for the support against the Morgana, sources say. And a final note, with their attention focused closer to home, the Imperial Japanese Navy left Morgana activity in the Celebes Sea in the hands of the British or the Dutch, at least for now. After that, we head back over to Europe to hear news from France, the third contributing member to the war against the Morgana. After having returned home from their actions in Dakar, the Alboran Sea, and at Martinique, the Marine Nationale continued to wrest through the war plan Repos et Restauration, with 92% of naval command in support. In the port of Brest, the Marine Nationale completed the necessary repairs and refits on the vessels of the forced raid. By the end of the week, they were as ready for battle as they had been on the first day of September. One member of the forced raid was missing, however, and a memorial service was held for the crew lost with M.N. Le Moulin. The destroyer herself was recalled fondly, and even if her sisters struggled to find kind words to describe her personality and nature, that was overlooked and forgiven in the general sorrow of the service. On a more positive note, there were other benefits to recuperation as well. Fleet officers were available to brief their colleagues in the Army de Terre on the progress and nature of the Morgana War, and to coordinate plans to address the German threat. Of greatest concern to the French was the strange weather patterns beginning to make themselves felt in northern France. The winter, which had been unseasonably cold, was becoming unseasonably warm. It was possible that if the trend continued, it might become warm enough to melt the snow, even in December. Unfortunately, in other news, despair continued her bleak work in the western Mediterranean, and several radio operators independently reported hearing her whispers on the air when she should by all rights have been out of range. Some reports state that some of those who spent too long listening ended their own lives as a result of what they heard. Meanwhile, in the Indian Ocean, the strange saga of the Bougainville came to an end. The Italians returned her to France, along with her well-fed and cared-for mascot. The entire affair was resolved with a commendable haste. However, a feeling was growing that the return of the Bougainville by the Italians was a further sign of French retreat outside of metropolitan waters. After that, we head across the Atlantic to hear news from the United States, who are the fourth contributing nation to our united front. This week, the Atlantic Fleet made most of the American public, and a majority of the media, a great deal happier. Following reports of sedition sightings around Prince Edward Island, Texas and a good portion of the fleet set off to intercept, and although the odds of finding her in the middle of the Atlantic were against them, Texas swore she always got her bad guy, and she was right. The photograph taken after the Battle of Texas, holstering her guns while the lead sedition sank in the background, made the front page of every paper in the country. The people of Texas even went so far as to declare it a public holiday. Newsreels of the victory made the rounds, theater-goers flocking to watch Gone with the Wind, were treated to a short film made aboard Texas herself on the battle. Behind the scenes, the Roosevelt administration signaled its support for taking the League of Nations up on its recent offer, membership. a key role in containing and studying captured Morgana technology for the entire world. All the old obstacles still applied, of course, ratifying the Treaty of Versailles, getting Congress's approval, and it was already clear, even with the League itself, that Article X needed to be further reworked to accommodate the strange and urgent demands of the Grand Morgana War. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt could make a compelling case that it was what Constitution would have wanted, and that it was what the world demanded, and the American people seemed prepared to listen. In other news, a fundraising rally for the Finnish relief fund Let's Help Finland was held at Madison Square Garden in New York. Herbert Hoover made a speech at the event, which was also broadcast to the American people. Donations are already soaring, although there are a significant number of Finns in the emigre community who believe that the present government cannot be trusted and should not be aided. Meanwhile, the SS Columbus was caught by HMS Hyperion off the coast of Virginia. Although Columbus was scuttled before she could be taken as a prize, the Tuscaloosa was in the area and took the crew and passengers safely aboard, as the Hyperion could not accommodate so many men and boys. And of final note, for the United States, the worst news of the week only came in hints and whispers, that one or more strange submarines had been sighted near the north coast of Panama. If it was a Morgana probe, there would certainly be more. Following that comes news from our comrades in the North, the Soviet Union, who are the fifth contributing member to our united front. This week, on the 18th, well after the Germans sunk a newly arrived Morgana battleship Sloth off the Gotland coast, an attachment of the Baltic Fleet found her idling in Estonian waters. Whether it was the same Sloth the Germans had faced 2 days prior is unknown. However, it wasn't long after the discovery that orders were received directly from Moscow, enacting the war plan Slothful Days, ordering the Baltic Fleet to engage and sink the Morgana battleship. It could fairly be said they were nervous. Though the exact details of the German battle weren't widely known, it was understood to have been destructive, and that close quarters were to be avoided at all costs. Still, the Soviets' crew were well trained and brave, and their bells knew how to make the most of them. At first, however, that didn't seem to be enough. Kirov and a handful of destroyers and submarines were ultimately outclassed by a Morgana battleship in a bad mood, and it would have seemed to any casual observer that their attack on her was utmost folly. But they were fast, and she was lazy, and they could prod her and withdraw, at least long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The reinforcement in question was Aurora. Sloth was, perhaps, ready for a conventional engagement. She was not, however, ready for an armored Russian avatar of war, ramming her at full speed, appearing on her deck and physically pummeling her into the ground. Sloth spares, who were so destructive against conventional ships, seemed cowed by the bell and hid anywhere they could. Of note, at more or less the same time, the bell of the Grozny specifically manifested to punch a swarm of the invading Medvez-Hada, as they're colloquially known, before fading away again. Sloth finally withdrew to the northwest after suffering a significant hull breach from a torpedo attack by SHCH-307. She did not get far, however. To paraphrase a short synopsis of a Pravda article on the battle, quote, "All things are well, and going the way the glorious comrade Stalin expected. What a birthday present for the General Secretary! What a week to be a Soviet citizen!" End quote. Meanwhile, reports of a ghostly presence at the Ordzhonikidze shipyard continued to come in. Security was dramatically escalated, and inefficiencies mounted across the Leningrad docks. Finally, something happened that has, at least temporarily, brought all progress in the shipyards to a complete halt, with regular maintenance and repairs now being rerouted to the naval bases in Liepaja and Tallinn, with the Baltic Fleet themselves rebasing to Tallinn. In other news, the Germans agreed to increase cooperation with the Soviet Union. U-boats and surface raiders were granted immediate access to anchorage and supply at Zapania Lista Bay in exchange for at-sea supply for Soviet submarines in the Baltic. The British lodged an immediate protest, which the Soviets have not replied to. An additional base will be made available in the Bering Sea, at Abashinsky, perhaps elsewhere in Rakovia Bay, sources say. While this will not allow Germany to threaten Allied interests in the Pacific, it may enable limited trade opportunities with the Empire of Japan. Further west in the Baltic, the Finnish belle Vainamoinen sent out another cipher, and the Baltic Fleet again answered her, reaching the Åland Islands on the 19th. Now, I thought I'd have to pry the information of this event from my good friend in the Red Navy, But to my surprise, he not only wanted to talk about the event despite the danger it could pose, but also sent in a recording for us to use live on air. And so, what you're about to hear, dear listener, is his retelling of the accounts there.
Привет, comrades. I felt it as part of the united front against the Morgana. This information had to make it to the wider world. What I'm about to tell you would make you think we're crazy, and probably are to some degree. But what I saw, what I heard there, that encounter, I will never forget. When we arrived, we found a woman herself, or Belle Vinemonen, standing in a small metal rowboat, farther away from her hull than was what to be known as possible. She had secrets to share with us, she said, and she thought it best that her crew was safe distance away. Vinemonen's story was hard to credit. Yurunda, or nonsense some would say, but she seemed sincere if cryptic. In her telling, prisoners from Finnish jails were vanishing and being turned over to the enemy. Finnish resources were being stolen by the ton and delivered to black ships in the mist, and Finnish ships were being sent to patrol and simply vanished. She said this was not the policy of the Finnish government, but the Morgana had ways of compulsion that she found difficult to root out. Vinemonen also said she didn't want the Soviets to win, but that there were threats far greater. At this time, she wasn't making any bargains. She simply hoped that if we survived, we would use this information wisely and selflessly. But there was obviously a discordant detail there, and one the Soviet officer present picked up on. "If we survive?" asked the officer. And then Vinemonen, with a smile, cheerfully said, "Would you like to see what drew Vinemonen to the Baltic in the first place? I can show you the way." And with that, silence. "It will be a terrible battle," she added. "My Drachya," sighed one of my comrades. And that was that. We gave each other nervous glances, wondering if we truly wanted to pull back the curtain and peek in on the Baba Yaga. After carefully adjusting her hat, Vinemonen rowed herself back to her own hull, and the rowboat vanished. She sailed off into the mist, and we reluctantly soon followed. Together we sailed towards these strange lights, though around them, in the dark, we heard the coughs of diseases, the laughter of sin, and the strange buzzing that we could not name. We also heard Vinemonen singing tenderly, too, and our bells whispered that it seemed to be keeping the Morgana distracted. Us too, more than likely. But as we soon found out, it wasn't just the singing. Finally, we came upon 3 delusions, and the whole of a vanity that no one had ever known was in the Baltic. It still burned, and it seemed that the delusions had killed her themselves. We listened through the radios to see what we could hear, and whatever the delusions were saying to one another, bzzz, it burned out the radios then and there. One radio man said he heard them saying they were calling the angel, but of course these were delusions, and they said stranger things than that all the time. Gordy, being Gordy, of course, claimed the first shot for herself. She did not aim at the delusions, however, but rather the web of lightning and wine-red madness that was churning over the vanity's corpse. The thing that came for her in response was like this wheel of fire out of the mist, instantly frying her electrical systems, igniting fires and burning strange scars into her hull. But her shot was perfectly placed. The delusions lost focus, and then whatever they were doing all fell apart, and the vanity exploded suddenly. The delusion nearest to it was caught in the blast, too, if I recall correctly. The other 2 delusions started firing at each other in confusion, and by the time Vinemonen and our ships, apart from that poor girl Gordy, joined in, the battle was already won. But it was in fact terrible to be there. The screams. There were screams in the air that came from nothing human, and whatever it was that had burned itself into Gordy was dead or gone. When it was done, the mist cleared, and Vinemonen said a jaunty goodbye, and we and our ships let her go. We weren't sure if we could have stopped her in any case, but not that we wanted to. And it seemed like the most urgent order of the day was agreeing on a report that wouldn't get us all committed to, unpleasant institutions or research facilities. Shortly after, we brought Gordy under tow and plotted a course for Tallinn. And that's all there was to it. I hope that this story, we'll call it, can help somehow or in some way. Do svidonya, and stay safe out there, my comrades.
Quite the horrifying tale, wasn't that, my dear listeners? I want to take a moment to personally thank my Soviet friend for telling us the harrowing tale and bringing such information to light, no matter how dangerous it may be to do so. He is truly a hero to our united front against the Morgana. Following that, we head west to hear news from Germany, the sixth contributing nation in our war against the Morgana. After having secured the coast of Heligoland Island, the Oberkommando der Marine saw it fit to go on the offensive, but this time targeting the unknown threat rather than the known quantity. This initiative found 64% support overall, and new orders came from Berlin enacting the war plan Sloth, calling for the Kriegsmarine to engage the newly arrived Morgana battleship Sloth in the Baltic Sea. Reports state that the battle began with what appeared to be stunning good luck from the start. Sloth was seemingly in a torpor, her main guns were quiet, her lookouts unmanned, and the water around still and calm. The decision was taken to close before opening fire, given the fact that her guns were not trained and there was no sign of combat readiness. As the German ship silently approached the point-blank range, lookouts reported patches of brown objects submerged in the water surrounding her. At first it was presumed to be a seaweed concentration, but soon it became apparent that they were something else. Something worse. They had the appearance of stuffed teddy bears, perhaps discarded by the Morgana, but in any event harmless and innocent enough. They were correct about the former, but horribly, horribly wrong about the latter. A survivor stated that, as they prepared their attack, suddenly monstrous swarms of teddy barin came clambering up the sides of their holes. They were horrible creatures of fang and claw, carrying knives and small arms. They had no bones to break. They skidded across the decks, defiant of logic and physics, and where they went, people died. At first, only the lookouts were at risk, but they were high above the ship and generally were safe from the waterlogged toys. However, a group of them came crawling down the barrel of one of Blücher's 20.3-centimeter guns, where the crew still had a breach open from clearing a shell that wasn't biting the threads. And from what he said, that's when the screaming started. And that is what awoke Sloth. The Germans fired immediately as their guns began training, and at their range they could hardly fail to hit. Sloth, however, was undeterred. In a 15-minute engagement, the destroyer KMS Bernhard von Arnim was sunk by her main guns. A mysterious explosion at the waterline wrecked KMS Königsberg's propeller, leaving her turning helplessly. And KMS Blücher's forward guns were all silenced by bears running amok in the interior of the ship. Sloth herself was sunk, burning from stem to stern at about 10:37 on the 16th, reports state, and the fleet returned to make port in Königsberg immediately after. KMS Königsberg, the ship itself, regained steering. The following day, possibly due to close contact with Sloth, KMS Admiral Graf Spee again experienced unusual dreams. The Oberkommando der Marine, already desirous to continue testing and evaluation of her Belle, took the opportunity to move her to a purpose-built area in the naval harbor where she will be fully evaluated. Treason remained active, sparring with Gustav V off the coast of Stockholm, and despite the fleet actions in the Baltic this week, the general tempo of Morgana attacks seemed to have nonetheless risen. In other news, a deal was struck with the Soviet Union to grant German U-boats and surface raiders immediate access to anchorage and supply at Zaporožye Bay, in exchange for at-sea supply for Soviet submarines in the Baltic. A simple blockade by sea was no longer a possibility for Britain. An additional base will be made available in the Bering Sea once officers can be dispatched to survey possible harbors. While this will not allow Germany to threaten Allied interests in the Pacific, it may enable limited trade opportunities with the Empire of Japan. In the same vein, it was also rumored, credibly, that Hitler was furious at Italy's decision to expand the Anglo-Italian agreement, and it's certain that Germany means to drive a wedge between both of them in the near-term future at the earliest possible opportunity. Alongside that, the SS Bremen arrived in German waters on the 15th, having made her way in a perilous passage from Murmansk down the Norwegian coast and then to Germany. Delayed by Morgana mines, Royal Navy patrols, and the blockade, she now rests safely in Bremerhaven. Due appreciation was extended to the Soviet Union, who delayed the departure of shipping from Murmansk for 3 days after her departure to prevent any intelligence of her whereabouts from reaching the Allies. Less fortunately, the SS Columbus was caught by HMS Hyperion off the coast of Virginia. Although the Columbus scuttled before the British could take her as a prize, the U.S. cruiser Tuscaloosa was in the area and took the crew and passengers safely aboard. Although this means that they will be treated as rescued seamen instead of prisoners of war, the cruiser's presence in the area raises many questions. Particularly, did the Americans guide the British to Columbus? Elsewhere, new U-boat tactics developed from the experience of the war to date are now in place. Reportedly, U-boats will now post their targets on the surface at night, where the advantage of the Royal Navy's ASDIC can be safely nullified. The tactic is already proven to be safe and lethal to enemy shipping. Meanwhile, in the west, the strange weather patterns beginning to make themselves felt in the Low Countries in western Germany. The winter, which had been unseasonably cold, was becoming unseasonably warm, and it was possible that if the trend continued, the snow might even melt in December. Subsequently, Christmas leave was cancelled by the Oberkommando der Marine. Lastly, of final note, the war has proven difficult for some officers. Captain Hans Langsdorff, formerly of Admiral Graf Spee, was found floating in full-dress uniform in Kiel Harbor on the 20th. Circumstances remain clouded, but it appears he left his barracks without being noticed by his staff or his guards, and may have accidentally fallen into the water and drowned. Lastly, but certainly not least, we head across the North Sea to hear the latest from the United Kingdom, the 7th contributing member to our war against the Morgana. With the war in Europe likely to escalate soon, Parliament convened to discuss possible solutions. Their latest proposal found 88% support from both houses, and later that day, Prime Minister Chamberlain announced the political play Skilled Labor, and his intention to expand the workforce and to train the able-bodied, male and female, for wartime occupations. Chamberlain further stated that the UK would have to be at the peak of industrial efficiency to make it through the war ahead. The decision to emphasize these programs was likely to have far-reaching consequences in maintaining and accelerating production, as more and more men were required for the armed services. Alongside that, the Chamberlain government and the Royal Navy announced that new restrictions were in effect surrounding HMS Victory, Lord Nelson's flagship, and the oldest commissioned naval vessel in the world. One of the few ships, even seemingly without a woken bell, that Morgana seemed legitimately to fear. Her berth at Portsmouth was to be fortified, and new structures to be built around her to protect from air attack as well as sea. On top of that, she would no longer be accessible to the public. If the Morgana wished to attack her, they would have to do so conventionally. This was not a universally popular move, however. Indeed, the First Lord of the Admiralty was reported to have argued that, quote, the Belle was really just sleeping until someone bothered to take her out to war, and who could blame her, end quote. The idea of the once and future victory became immediately attractive in certain circles, and hiding her from the enemy was more of the concession and prevarications they had come to expect from the present government. In other news, the people of Britain were experiencing something they were calling the December spring, as the weather was turning unseasonably warm and stormy in Britain. By contrast, the Low Countries and northern France were warm, but without the storms. Looking back towards foreign affairs, it was rumored that Hitler was furious at Italy's decision to expand the Anglo-Italian agreement, and possibly related reports began to come in that new U-boat tactics were endangering the convoy system. The Germans were now engaging at night and on the surface where ASDIC could not detect them. At present, the only counter was more escorts. Alongside that report came sporadic reports claiming that the Morgana was surging in the Baltic and the Alboran Sea, and the main Kriegsmarine fleet, such as it was in the Baltic. And with that concludes the League of Nations War Report for the 3rd week of December. A lot happened this week, and despite that, the nations of the world seem to have come out on top for now. However, this doesn't mean you should rest on your laurels. The Morgana can strike at any time and anywhere, so you should always be vigilant, lest our foreign invaders get the upper hand. And as a reminder to all captains and citizens alike that this League of Nations broadcast is intended on keeping you informed about the unified war effort against the Morgana. But I'd also like to remind you that it's that time of year again, dear listener. Amidst the turmoil and conflict over the world, it can be easy to forget that it's the holiday season, and that Christmas is just a few days away. If you haven't already, you should get those you care about a nice gift, or spend some time with the family around the fireplace. And if you're feeling extra generous this holiday season, consider purchasing some war bonds to show our fighting men and women across the globe some extra support. War bonds make an excellent gift as your support not only funds the war against the Morgana, but also nets you prestige among your peers. And if you still need a gift, you can use some of that prestige you've got to get a fun holiday-themed costume for that special captain or belle you have in your heart. Thank you for listening, and may you have smooth seas.